Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be going through some things that I suspect you might want the developers to take a look at with the future Legion patches. Now, I'm not hating on the expansions, very much in my good books so far, but let's just get right into it with making the Withered scenario fun after your upgrades. One big gripe that I've got about a bit of gameplay that I love is how the Withered scenario just runs out of steam. And now, to be clear, I love the gameplay, especially with how it manages to create a super different feeling to normal WoW. But it does get a little bit irrelevant, so how could it continue to be relevant? Well, one way you could do that is to have the chests continue to spawn after you collected them. I would have it so that these chests drop a pretty varied assortment of stuff that feel properly rewarding. What kind of stuff? Well, you know, pots, flasks, buff food, bit of gold, things like that, maybe crafting materials like the Bloods of Sargeras. Right now there are small chests, but they're not really that exciting. I'd also like to have a good chance of getting a pretty good gold reward from this, something that would be rare but would really feel good, kind of like your Indiana Jones busting into a place and, you know, getting a crazy cool treasure at the very end. Another way that you could add repeat value to this is having it so that the actual bosses drop rewards, because right now the bosses feel super pointless in some ways. That would give you a reason to complete the entire place and not just go until you've got the 400 points and then get yourself killed. Difficulty is also a bit of an issue here, it doesn't scale at all, so ideally, I think future patches could add more difficult areas to the Withered scenario. Another way of doing things would be to have a sort of hard mode that's based on player choice. Ideally, something a bit like the Ulduar hard mode that's like a button that you hit in the world. This would give you abilities to the current sets of bosses, increase their stats, stuff like that. And then you'd have a bonus to either the quality or quantity of loot that you get. I know that begins to feel like a Diablo 3 system, but I think it might make a decent fit. Of course, it is very important throughout this that this isn't too rewarding and that it's not some sort of like pseudo requirement that you always have to do. With that covered, it's time for the Emissary cache rewards. So this point was going to be about the Emissary caches and how they don't really give good enough rewards. However, Blizzard have actually patched that. The gear that they now give is actually in line with the gear that the world quests will normally give, and I'm pretty sure it can Warforge as well. I'm still not particularly convinced that the Emissary caches are the most exciting overall, and I like the idea of having breadcrumb items to sort of wider quests and little random adventures being one of the things in the loot table for those Emissary caches. I think that would make it a little bit more dynamic and interesting. And additionally, I actually do think that things like materials, potions, stuff like that would be pretty decent rewards from things like one of those chests. Another criticism that I have is that the consolation rewards just sometimes feel like a bit of a kick in the teeth, honestly. Now, when you kill Withered Jim, and Withered Jim gives you no loot, and then you roll a bonus coin, and the bonus coin gives you 32 gold, that feels rubbish. One of the reasons why it feels rubbish is because you spent between 1,000 and 3,000 gold on that coin, most likely, so getting that 32 gold back doesn't particularly feel like a reward. I definitely feel that the consolation reward, so whenever you kill a boss in LFR, or, well, not an LFR, whatever, whenever you kill a boss like Withered Jim or, world boss, and you don't get that main roll, and then you use your bonus coin, and then you don't win from that, which, let's be real, is the majority of times you'll actually try to loot one of those bosses. Yeah, I just think those sort of consolation prizes kind of suck at the minute. They haven't really changed in value much since, Mists of Pandaria, so that really is something that could be due for a change. As I've said before, I think, the likes of potions, materials, lots of stuff like that would be a pretty good way to go with this for a starter. And then obviously I would like on top of that more interesting items, vanity items, stuff like that, so that it's very much a case that, yeah, you can get your gear, but there's also a good chance of getting other rewards that are decently exciting for people. Next, we've got Raid Group World Quest completion. So, I've noticed that there are some world quests that end up scaling to the point where even if you're in a group of 8 people, it still takes a bloody long time to kill the thing, but if you're in a raid group, you don't get credit. That's not really well explained by the game's default UI, and I imagine it leaves a lot of players confused, so I'd either add that into the game as, a UI to tell you, by the way, you're not going to get quest completion, and perhaps a message in chat, or I would loosen up that restriction, so that it's limited to maybe raids of, say, 10 or more players, so that maybe a team of 8 or 9 could still go and do that content and, benefit from the scaling. I understand that Blizzard doesn't want Zergs of 40 players, romping across the zones, doing every world quest with ease, cool as that would maybe look. I think that it could be better communicated to players, and overall that system could work just a little bit better than it does at the minute. Next, SURAMAR rep gain. I imagine this is a touchy subject, and it's one that I'm personally a little bit torn on. On the one hand, you do want to make character progression really matter, but on the other hand, realistically speaking, people do want to have multiple characters. If you make it too easy, then it makes characters feel throwaway. If you make it too hard, then you get a lot of negative feedback, and SURAMAR somewhat does show that. Now, another aspect with the attunement is that it basically gates characters such that generally the more experienced characters will have access to Archway and Court of Stars. Now, this would make more sense if it was a dungeon attunement that was gained by doing dungeons, since, doing some world quests doesn't really prove that you're good enough to do a harder instance, so that's a little bit strange. But there is some good news. In patch 7.1, they're actually softening some of this stuff up. So in 7.1, Archway and Court of Stars are going to be account-wide unlocks, and they're also making it so that the world quests are unlocked as soon as you hit level 110, and I think that does solve most of people's concerns surrounding the alt-friendliness of this specific issue. Next, I'd like a generic press F being an example key, to interact with an object or NPC. This is something that I've seen in loads of other MMOs. Essentially, it's the idea that, if you have a quest item and it's just in front of you, then you just, hit F on your keyboard, it's your generic interact button for the game, and then no matter what the object is, your character just interacts with it. I think this would be super handy. It would mean you wouldn't have to fiddle around with the mouse all the time. In World of Warcraft, most of us move around with the right mouse button held down, so then having to release the right mouse button in order to free up the cursor to then left click, or no, I suppose right click on something, but that's still really obtuse. That's too many mouse movements, when a lot of games just have this solution where you have a generic interaction button that works in anything that's directly in front of you, including quest items. I think that would be a very good way for Blizzard to do things, and it would help to make World of Warcraft feel just that little bit more modernized. Next, follower equipment. I would like a more fun way to get it. So currently, follower equipment is a little bit annoying. Most of it is based off complete randomness with the work orders. I would like it if there was some sort of real gameplay involved with these. One of the big pushes with the order hulls was that they'd be sending you out into the world. Therefore, I think it's strange, to me anyway, that a lot of the champion equipment is obtained mostly from missions and work orders. I think it would be pretty cool if they added epic and legendary follower equipment as rewards from a bit more of the content that already exists in the world of Legion. Now, to be clear, these would be an additional loot roll. They wouldn't be taking the place of any regular rewards. What kind of content, though, do you think would be good for giving people follower equipment? And do you think there's any kind of gameplay they could do there that's interesting? And I suppose on a similar topic, off-duty champions. Currently, it feels weird that you've got 8 champions and you can only have 5 active, so 3 of them have to always be deactivated. Now, in Warlords, I get it. There were so many followers that having a useful purpose for all of the inactive ones would have just been game-breaking. However, in Legion, everyone has 8 followers by default. I'd be very curious to see if Blizzard could make some sort of system where your deactivated followers wouldn't be deactivated and they'd still be doing something for you. Now, that said, I don't want to see an overall expansion of this system, as I don't think this system is really where the good future of World of Warcraft lies. But that said, for Legion, maybe we could think about something to do with those extra champions. Next, clipping. This one astounds me. Legion has brought so many, I think, production quality increases with World of Warcraft, so it's really strange when you see armor clipping. It's a real pain in the ass. I understand that having the same piece of armor work for many different races and gender combinations as well is a really, really tough task, but I do feel that it not working and, this clipping happening does give this really amateurish feeling. Now, I've got to wonder what Blizzard's internal testing and QA process for things like this is, and what sort of tools they've actually developed to find out when issues like this are occurring. Now, the armor types that are in question, or the ones that cause these clipping problems, they all have 3D geometry. What that means is you've got access to a mesh that you can work with. Now, writing a system to find out whether a mesh intersects and what order the intersections go, to identify clipping with the base, the mesh of your actual character model would be quite easy. Now, I say this, I work in Unity for the most part, so we have things like the mesh filter component, which really do make life pretty easy when it comes to working with stuff like this. But while Blizzard are in a very old engine, I've got to imagine with their crazy amount of resources, they'd be able to make the tools for something like this. As an example, what I said earlier, a hood hiding a character's hair, like it should just be like that. And normally it is, but then there's an outlier, which essentially means that a piece of armor is not really wearable for transmog purposes because it just looks broken as hell. Now, this is definitely a nitpick, but I think it would be something that's really nice to fix, especially when Blizzard have put so much effort into making the animations feel better. It makes sense that just some of these silly little issues would be fixed. Next, talents. Now, I've got a bit of a mixed feeling on how the new talent swapping rules are, but what I would like to see is the ability to change talents for free at the start of a dungeon or raid. Currently, this does work for queued content like heroic dungeons. I think it would be a nice addition to expand this out to the mythics and the raids. How? Well, you just have some sort of magical MacGuffin, item thing at the entrance of an instance. It would be single use, you click on it and then you get a buff, which says you can swap your talents for a minute. That would be really handy. Basically, it's a pain in the ass when you get summoned into your raid instance, but you've then got to port back to Dalaran just to swap your talents, and then have to get 2 people to go outside of the raid to summon you back in. That just feels so clunky, and I think this would be a pretty good way of getting around that annoyance without, crippling the inscription market. But that's pretty much it for the little nitpicks that I've got with Legion so far. I know with a video like this, and I did ask for feedback on Twitter, a lot of people just said, make less RNG for gear. Now that's more of a game design sort of question. The whole point of this video is just small little things that I feel like Blizzard could probably, fix or work just a little bit on in a patch, in a small patch that would increase the overall quality of the game. But that's pretty much it for me. I'm really keen to see what sort of things that maybe are getting on your nerves, just, a little bit, the little small annoying things, and how you think they could be fixed up, because I'm sure that would also just be information that the developers would like to hear. But anyway, that's it for me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.